Welcome to the Mysteryaholic podcast. I am your host, Shannon. And if this is your first time here, this podcast is going to cover lots of topics such as serial killers, solved and unsolved murders, supernatural events, and mysteries just of all kinds. Pardon my way I sound today. I have a slight little sniffles going on. And if you listen to my first podcast, I am so sorry my audio sucked, but I have a new microphone, so this one should be good. Today, we are going to cover a kind of unsolved murder. Has a lot of gaping holes in it, so maybe if you know anything about the story, you can add to it, throw me a comment or a email, and I'll be happy to add in there. I typed up notes, so I am gonna add a file page to my website, and those notes will be there under cases that I have a lot to say about. So this one is going to be the case of William McNutt. Let's start by going to the beginning. It started on July 24th, 1919. This happened in Spokane, Washington. Long story, but my husband and I got on this because we read an article from 100 years ago and found it fascinating. So we kind of looked into it, and it was just like, wow. It was just wow. So I decided to do that as the first kind of unsolved murder. On July 24th, 1919, the distraught wife of William McNutt told police that he had disappeared from his offices 2 weeks prior, and she had not heard a word since. I don't know why it took her 2 weeks to go to the police, but that's what was reported. He's normally known as W.H. McNutt. He was a well-known Spokane stockbroker specializing in mining stocks, apparently. She told police she was convinced that some unknown men had abducted him, murdered him, and taken his body away in his car for disposal. I mean, she was pretty thorough there. She said there had been no estrangement between them. Talked about how devoted he was to her and their children. He had never gone away without leaving, word with her where he was going. She said at the time of his disappearance, he was driving a fancy Belgian blue Stevens car, which he had bought from a Spokane car dealer. Friends that were familiar with the car reported they had seen it on the streets 2 or 3 times since his disappearance, but apparently he was not driving. On the next day, July 25th, she was no longer convinced he had been murdered. She now thought that he might be hiding on a farm he owned, and I'm going to butcher it, Pendorel County near Newport. They're still in Washington. That was based on a report that someone saw somebody erecting some buildings on a farm that was owned by Mr. McNutt. Apparently, Mrs. McNutt was on the way to the small town where he owned the farm in Scotia, and she was accompanied by the Pendorel County Sheriff and a Burns Agency detective to check it out. Now, interesting fact, the Burns Agency was started by a William John Burns, and he was known as America's Sherlock Holmes. I'm guessing it was common back in those days for detective agencies to work hand in hand with the police. That's why I love reading old news articles. It's just fascinating about how different everything was back then. All right, moving on with our story. Around the same time, other reports had come in that people had seen Mr. McNutt driving his Stevens auto on Appleway, even though before they were saying he wasn't behind the wheel, so I don't know. There was something else that There was men who had a financial dispute with him abruptly left Spokane after his disappearance, and detectives had traced the men to Los Angeles. Also, the auto dealer in Spokane, where that fancy Belgian blue Stevens car came from, said that Mr. McNutt had not yet paid for the car, and he actually wanted the police to issue a warrant for his arrest. Now, the following day, we're just on July 26th now, the Mrs. McNutt was again convinced that her husband had been abducted and murdered. She said he had left his office on June 24th with the intention of collecting a large sum of money that was owed to him by some people he was in partnership with on a rooming house. Apparently, he had encountered trouble with these people before, and they had once threatened to shoot him if he approached them again. Those people had now disappeared, which I'm guessing that that's what they were talking about before, the men who had a financial dispute. And if they thought they went to Los Angeles, the police did. She believed they shot him and then drove off with his body in his own car. A deputy sheriff working on the case didn't really buy it, thought maybe Mr. McNutt was alive and in hiding. I don't know if there was something about Mrs. McNutt that people knew that, wasn't reported, but who knows? There was a report that he was seen at the farm that he owned near Newport previously, but that proved to be false. And police were working with police in a different city, apparently Los Angeles. So, on July 25th, the police found the Belgian blue Stevens car. It was actually in the possession of Faye Wilkinson and her relatives. These were the people who had purchased the Wolverine Hotel in Spokane for Mr. McNutt on a contract. He had gone to the hotel to collect money several times, according to Mrs. McNutt, and they had threatened him. He disappeared after trying to collect one more time, and so did they after he disappeared. Investigators traced them to Los Angeles, where police spotted the car. When confronted, Faye Wilkerson says she bought the car from Mr. McNutt and she had a bill of sales. Apparently, she was well known to Spokane police, and she went by name, Faye McDonald, Mrs. Frank Pryor. I have no idea why, and Miss Blake. And apparently, she had all of her household goods shipped to Los Angeles under the name of Miss Blake. Since they couldn't find Mr. McNutt, there was really nothing they could do to, as far as an arrest in a murder or disappearance. But an arrest was made on August 28th. They arrested Marie McDonald and her brother Ted McDonald, though they didn't really make any details of it available to the press. And even at that time, they weren't sure whether Marie McDonald was one of Faye Wilkerson's aliases, or whether she was actually Faye's sister. So it gets kind of convoluted there. So let's go back to these people who fled Spokane. Now, they're all siblings. We have Marie and Faye, and then we have Ted and Will. Now, the McDonald sisters were often referred to as Marie Wilkinson and Faye Wilkinson while they lived in Spokane, because both sisters had been married to a Mr. Wilkinson. I believe his first name was William as well. Marie was married to him first, and after they divorced, Faye, who was only 15 at the time, married him. They described it as an unusual love triangle, And at the time that they were doing this investigation, it was possible that Faye was still married to Mr. Wilkerson. Police were trying to find him to get more information about their weird situation. Um, and apparently, it wasn't Marie McDonald's first time with the law. She was arrested and put on trial just 3 years prior in 1916 for allegedly setting fire to her own house for insurance purposes. The fire marshal found traces of kerosene through the house. Her attorneys alleged that it was her enemies, whoever that might be. And it actually ended up in a hung jury, and the charges were dropped. At that time, she was described as a former vaudeville singer and actress. So that to me comes in handy later on because, the actress part. All right, so back to the case. On September 3rd, Mrs. McNutt went to Los Angeles to seek clues about her husband's disappearance after the arrest of Marie and Ted. It seems like Mrs. McNutt is like super involved in everything here. Both the siblings denied any involvement, of course, telling police they had left because of domestic discord. Telling police that Mr. McNutt had left because of domestic discord, of which Mrs. McNutt was not happy, and she hotly denied it. Mrs. McNutt ended up telling police that there was absolutely no domestic discord in our home. She was convinced that he was murdered. His life had been threatened. Her life had been threatened. When he left, he was driving the car, which was tracked to Los Angeles. But when he left, he had told her he would be back in 2 hours, that he was going to the Miss McDonald's hotel. And he had a large sum of money on him when he left home. I don't know why. He also had a check on him in his pocket, which was in possession, she claims, Miss McNutt claims, was in the possession of a woman who tried to cash it the next day at one of Spokane's department stores. So a few days go by, and I guess they had like a little hearing. So on September 6th, Mrs. McNutt says she was so certain her husband had been murdered because she found a large blood stain on the floor of Marie McDonald's room at the Wolverine Hotel. I mean, Mrs. McNutt should have opened her own detective agency. She is like super involved here. She also testified that when she examined the room, that she found another spot on the rug under the floor, like something reddish had been washed away. She denied that her and her husband had quarreled or that she had ever threatened him with a revolver, of which I'm not sure who accused her of that or why that was even brought up. So nothing happens for a little bit, but eventually, of course, it was going to happen. The body of W.H. McNutt was found on that farm property he owned near Scotia on October 3rd. The first-degree murder charges were set against Faye, Marie, Will, and Ted McDonald. As soon as the body was found, the 2 McDonald women were arrested, and the 2 brothers were being sought. Detectives in Los Angeles, their theory was Mr. McNutt confronted the McDonalds. One of the McDonalds accosted Mr. McNutt at gunpoint, and they forced him to sign a bill of sale for his auto. So, I mean, they actually did have one. Then they killed him and drove his body to the farmland in Newport by Scotia. They buried the body, covered the grave with wood, and set it on fire in order to disguise it. And apparently Mrs. McNutt, our little detective sleuth, was present when the body was exhumed and was reported that she nearly fainted and almost fell into the open grave. So here's another interesting little tidbit. Mrs. McNutt had earlier hired a Spokane medium to use her psychic powers to solve the mystery. The medium told Mrs. McNutt that her husband had been murdered and buried on a ranch. However, of course, police didn't believe that stuff back then, so they didn't go search the ranch based on, recommendation from a psychic. They instigated the search on the farm because information was telegraphed by detectives in Los Angeles. And we'll get to how they knew to go search that ranch here in a little bit. So one of the brothers, Ted, was arrested in Fresno. His brother, Will, took off and was still at large. They believe that the two McDonald brothers were the one who actually committed the murder and disposed the body. The Burns Agency detectives in California were the ones that broke open the case after a unidentified and mysterious person phoned them in Los Angeles and relayed the information that led to finding the body. Now, there was some indication that the missing brother Will had escaped to Arizona and was on his way to Mexico. So the local Spokane press reported some more details on October 5th. First, the mystery caller who told police where to find Mr. McNutt's body hadn't made just one anonymous phone call to detectives. He called every few days for 2 weeks to add information to the story. He never identified himself, although he did say he was an intimate friend of the McDonalds and said that they told him their secrets. There's speculation the next day on October 6th that this mystery informant was actually William Wilkinson, who had been married to both Marie and her sister Faye. Los Angeles detectives were combing the city looking for him because they still haven't found him. And apparently, this was some eyewitness stuff. William Wilkerson left with the McDonald's for Los Angeles, and he was still apparently married to Faye. Neighbors in California said that he lived with his young wife in the Los Angeles bungalow for about 3 weeks before they separated. He still had been visiting, and the neighbors had heard them quarreling on numerous occasions. Meanwhile, Ted told police in Fresno that he was at his sister's residence when the murder was committed, but he denied taking part. Will, the other brother, is still at large. So they did extradition proceedings on October 8th. Faye and Marie were trying to battle the extradition. They didn't want to go back to Spokane. They're still searching for Will. They did find his young wife, who was living with their parents in Los Angeles. She claimed that she had been married to him for only 2 months, and that once he discovered he was wanted by authorities, he had sent her to Los Angeles from Spokane. Then he disappeared. And of course, she staunchly defended him. There was no way he could do anything like that. The Burns Agency again came into play and said that they had a solid lead on his whereabouts. They now believed he was working in a lumber camp and, quote unquote, his arrest was imminent. All right, so we go to October 14th. The Spokane newspaper said the extradition hearing for the two McDonald sisters was scheduled for October 15th. Papers filed with the court laid out the evidence against them in the murder of Mr. McNutt. The papers allege that McNutt and the McDonald's quarreled over business issues the day before his death. The next day, Mary McDonald attempted to cash a check, which had been in Mr. McNutt's pocket. Um, and she tried to cash that at a Spokane department store. But I don't know what happened. She and her sister Faye left Spokane in haste and fled to Los Angeles under assumed names. Paper also stated that, after a months long search and anonymous tip that his body had been found in Newport, buried 4 feet deep, he had been bludgeoned and his mouth had been stuffed with towels. A bonfire had been built over the grave to hide it. And of course, the three siblings adamantly denied their guilt. They lost their fight for extradition on October 21st and were bound from Los Angeles to Spokane to stand trial for the murder of W.H. McNutt. Their brother, who wasn't fighting extradition, was expected to be sent to Spokane separately than them. They were arraigned in Superior Court on December 4th. At this time, Will, the missing brother, is still at large. December 10th, they arrived at the courthouse for, their preliminary hearing. And they're all smiling as if there's not a care in the world in this picture. He was charging each of them the prosecutor was charging each of them as principals in the murder of McNutt. He said it made no difference who struck the fatal blow. They're all guilty. He said in this quote, "It's common law and common sense. I charge them all with being principals." The newspaper reported that Faye and Ted seemed very sure of themselves and they quotation, gazed about with an air that seemed even a bit defiant. However, they lost that confidence as the hearing proceeded, and apparently Marie was described as pale, drawn, nervous, and unstrung. The full trial was scheduled for January, which actually started on January 16th. Where after the first full day of testimony, the jury was escorted out of the courtroom and went to go to the Wolverine lodging house because the prosecutor wanted the jury to see the scene of the crime. The prosecutor that first day laid out his case against Marie, Faye, and Ted. Here are his main points. That McNutt owned the Wolverine building and the McDonald's were operating it as a lodging house. That the McDonald's had also arranged to construct a building on land that Mr. McNutt owned. Yeah, near that farm in Scotia, near Newport. That in previous days, neighbors at the Wolverine had heard loud disputes between McNutt and the McDonald's, and Faye McDonald Wilkinson had once brandished a hammer and threatened to strike him in the head. On the fateful day, McNutt was observed going into the Wolverine where occupants heard a commotion in one of the rooms. Things suddenly became quiet and McNutt was never seen leaving the Wolverine. His car remained parked outside until at least evening. That the McDonald's had in fact murdered McNutt in a Wolverine room, took the body out the back way and drove it in McNutt's own pickup truck to the farm near Scotia. That they buried him on the farm and started a bonfire over the site. Pieces of the Wolverine carpet were found with the body. So the defense attorney for the McDonald siblings came back hard with his own revelations the next day on January 17th. He claimed that McNutt had been brutal to Mary McDonald and had choked her and threatened to throw her down a fire escape. One woman testified she had witnessed an earlier quarrel between the two in the Wolverine lodging house stairway. and that, this is quotation mark, McNutt had an ugly look on his face. Excuse me. She said Faye McDonald then appeared from another doorway and said, "If he hits my sister, I will fix him with this hammer." The witness said that she had once run into McNutt, who was searching for Marie, and it was some weirdness. I told him she didn't want to see him because she was afraid of him. That's what the witness told McNutt. And the witness also said that Marie McDonald had vowed to quit McNutt as soon as she could make a new start. Apparently, Mrs. McNutt was visibly distressed during the testimony relating to his conduct toward Marie McDonald. Let's see. On January 18th, things moved pretty fast back then. On January 18th, it came out that Marie McDonald and W.H. McNutt have been having an affair. It showed that they had once had a relationship other than the business way, but the relationship turned sour. Several witnesses testified they had been heard quarreling in the Wolverine apartments. McNutt's former business partner took the stand and said he went over to the Wolverine apartments the next day after McNutt disappeared and asked Faye if she knew where McNutt was. Faye answered with her own question, "Have you seen anything of Sis?" When he said he hadn't, Faye replied, "Well, they probably went fishing." I'm not sure if this was something that was normal that Marie and McNutt did normally. I found that odd. A new testimony also emerged about the gravesite. A neighbor said he saw Will and Ted drive into the site and in the truck belonging to McNutt the day after McNutt disappeared. Later, they noticed a fire burning on the land. And still, at this point, you guessed it, Will is still at large. Now, the siblings' defense attorney, his name is Thomas Corkery, completely throws Will under the bus on January 19th. It said that Will and Will alone killed W.H. McNutt, and also that Will and Will alone buried the body. So let's see what else Corkery said. That Will had come upon McNutt cursing and kicking Marie at the Wolverine. He had interfered. McNutt drew a revolver on him, and Will struck McNutt on the head with a hammer and killed him. Now, I'm thinking there's a hammer, and we already got Faye threatening to hit him with a hammer, so I don't know about that. One of the sisters supposedly urged Will to call the police, but he said he talked them out of it. The defense attorney admitted that the siblings had been foolish enough to follow Will's suggestions. He also told the jury that Marie and McNutt had become intimate, that McNutt had represented himself to be a single man and had become abusive. She had fled from him at least once and sought protection in the offices of Reverend John G. Lake, a divine healer. And I'm not going to go into that, but it is kind of interesting. You should Google the Reverend John G. Lake and read about his healing centers. It was kind of interesting read. More of the story. Apparently, McNutt sought Marie out at the Reverend's, and quotation affected a reconciliation, at least for a while. I don't know what that means or what that entailed back then. The fatal quarrel, according to the defense attorney, was apparently incited by Marie's refusal to accept a third-party bid to purchase the Wolverine. McNutt accused her of knocking his deal. Marie took the stand and testified that McNutt fired his gun 2 or 3 times before Will picked up the hammer and hit him on the head. She knew nothing more about it because she woke up on the couch after she had fainted. The prosecution attempted to poke holes in the story of the sisters by demonstrating that there were no bullet holes in the Wolverine apartment. Uh, Faye and Marie both testified that he had drawn a revolver and fired several times. However, the sheriff and deputy took a stand to say that after a thorough search of the crime scene, they found no bullet holes. The defense was trying to say that the room had been repaired and wallpapered since the incident. It makes no sense whatsoever. Ted was also cross-examined that day. He testified he was not even at the Wolverine at the time of the murder, though previously he did say he was at the hotel, but hadn't had any part of it. So he kind of caught himself in a lie. He claims now he knew nothing about it until later that evening when he arrived and his sisters told him that Will had killed McNutt. His sisters told him that Will had already departed with the body on the way to that Scotia ranch, and that his sisters wanted him to drive out there to try to get Will to bring the body back and notify the police. But when Ted drove out to the ranch, Will told him it was too late. He had already buried the body. On January 20th, Corkery, the defense attorney, gave his summation, claiming that McNutt had a chip on his shoulder. He was hopping mad, kind of almost like he was asking for it when he went to the hotel. The prosecutor, of course, was like, the McNutt murder was a fiendish murder, and all the McDonalds were equally guilty. He said the body had been bound and gagged, and that the McDonalds deliberately robbed the dead man. He was found in a shallow grave, stripped of cash, diamonds, and that check. Now the jury came back pretty quick. They came back on January 22nd, and they declared all three of the siblings not guilty. But they weren't free for very long. Deputies immediately rearrested Faye and Marie McDonald on charges of forgery related to that check that they tried to cash at the Spokane department store. They also arrested Ted McDonald on charges of grand larceny because the car, apparently they thought he was the one driving that Mr. McNutt's car. The local newspaper described the new complaints as the equivalent of a bomb set off in the camp of the defense attorneys. The stunned attorneys started immediately arguing for a reduction in the siblings' bonds. They were each set at $2,000, but the judge reduced the bonds of the sisters to $1,000 and kept Ted's at $2,000. Murder charges still stood against Will, who, I bet you guessed it, was still at large. I don't know how, but the next day all three siblings were out on bail, and there was nothing I could find after that between January and April. But I did find that on April 7th, Faye McDonald, this quotation mark, broke into a storm of weeping when a Spokane jury convicted her of first-degree forgery. She apparently was super mad, too, because she walked up to the prosecutor, and this quotation mark, I love how they worded stuff back then. With anger choking her words, she began talking to the prosecutor before she was stopped by her uncle. So she was liable to a sentence of at least 5 years in the penitentiary. Marie and Ted were still facing their charges. Most of the testimony in Marie's trial, which began on April 9th, was similar to what was presented in Faye's. And Sorry. My computer made the super loud noise and I about jumped out of my chair because I'm all into this story right now. So on that was on April 9th. The prosecution contended that the McDonald sisters took the check from his body. They forged a false name on it. And I don't know why. What for? I never said what false name. They attempted to cash at a local department store before losing their nerve and fleeing without the money or the check. On April 11th, the jury found Marie McDonald guilty of first degree forgery. And like her sister Faye, who was convicted the week before, she reacted in a dramatic fashion, but in a different way. The newspaper wrote, and I quote, 2 minutes after the conclusion of the trial, the defendant collapsed in a faint and was carried from the courtroom and placed in an automobile. Her sister Faye was quoted as saying, I know she will die. I think she will die before morning. I mean, they're pretty dramatic. Another relative was saying, I do not know how any jury could sleep tonight after they convicted her. I do not see how women could convict her. So, the paper, before I go on with that, remember Marie used to be an actress. That's why I was like, when I said she was listed as a former vaudeville singer and actress. Remember, she used to be an actress, and I think that she played that very well. Because it'll come into her sentencing later that you'll see she even had the judge. I mean, I think she did very well with her acting. Anyway, going on, the paper also stated that Marie and Ted still faced yet another trial, this one on the charges that they stole the dead man's automobile and drove it to California. This was the first that I saw that Marie had been charged with that as well. I thought it was only Ted. The next thing I could find was Marie was sentenced on May 17th to 1 and 20 years in the state penitentiary at Walla Walla on a charge of forgery. Basically, it was 1 year. I couldn't find anything or any mention of what Faye's sentence was. I'm guessing it would be about the same. The judge at Marie's sentencing, though, I quote, I love these quotes because I'm telling you, nobody talks like this anymore. And I think if a judge said this to a woman now in a courtroom, it would not be a pretty sight. So the judge said, and I quote, this defendant has so appealed to my sympathy that if I were permitted to do so, I would tell her, go, woman, and sin no more. The law, however, does not permit me to do so. I cannot even imagine just telling that to a woman today. Go, woman, and sin no more. Oh. Next thing I could find was on June 4th. A petition was signed by 75 Spokane citizens requesting that the governor grant a full pardon to Marie. The most surprising thing was that it included the signatures of practically every member of the Superior Court jury which had found her guilty in the first place, including the jury foreman. The petition stated that she had recently been diagnosed with incipient pulmonary tuberculosis. And that, my folks, was all I could find. I couldn't find anything about the grand larceny charge for Ted and apparently Marie. I never saw where Will had been found and brought to trial. For all I know, he escaped to Mexico and they never saw him again. And I need to state that I'm not an avid researcher. I don't subscribe to anything to research. This was just things I've found in the local papers. I didn't go to the courthouse. I didn't read trial transcripts. So a lot of this information I have does have a lot of gaping holes that I'm hoping maybe my listeners will know more about, and you can fill me in, and I can update this this file that I'm going to upload to the website today. So here are my questions that I had while I was searching through this story. I know eyewitnesses report a lot eyewitness reports are wrong a lot of times. But what friends saw that Belgian Blue Stevens car on the streets without McNutt behind the wheel? And were they not curious why someone else was driving his car? Uh, I don't know. Was it normal for him to let other people drive his car? I don't know. Also, somewhere in there, a witness has said that someone was on his farm erecting buildings during the time of his disappearance. I know that there was talk between the McDonald's and him about doing construction, um, some kind of buildings near that farm in Scotia, but they pretty much disappeared like immediately after McNutt was murdered. So who was over on that ranch building buildings? I don't know. My next questions. I know that was quite a few questions. My next question: was the mysterious caller to the Burns Agency detectives in California actually William Wilkinson? Did they ever find him? Because there is no mention of him at all during the murder trials or the forgery trials or anywhere. I don't know that they were ever found him or if he was ever present or whatever happened with him. Why did Marie forge a check, go to a department store and try to cash it, but then left without the cash or check? I have all kind of questions about that. I mean, did she get caught and recognized? Did she lose? It must have been something weird. I don't know. I want to know what Faye's sentence was for the first degree forgery. Did Marie get released from prison following that petition? Was Ted convicted of grand larceny? What was his sentence? And there were so many leads during this whole thing on where Will McDonald might have gone. Did they ever find him and bring him to trial? And I guess my number one, who actually killed William H. McNutt? Was it Will alone like the siblings claim, or did they all have a hand in it? That is, I know this is a pretty long podcast today. That was all I have for the William H. McNutt trial. If you like our podcast, be sure to visit our website, mysteryaholic.com. You'll find links to our social media accounts. Like us, follow us, subscribe to our YouTube channel. While on the site, be sure to subscribe to the newsletter. I like to do promotions, give away polls, fun facts, fun stuff. You can also drop me a line. Let me know if you know anything about this case or if there's a story you want to share or topic you'd like me to cover. Until next time, if it goes bump in the night, it probably is something. Always be vigilant. Good night.